So thank you everyone for joining us. Before we begin, firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on today. I come to you from the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and acknowledge any of our amazing Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander colleagues and participants who may be here today. Also, I'd like to say always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So thank you, and thank you all for being here. Next slide, please. So this presentation is really about looking at the viability of Create New South Wales grants. It's also really looking at thinking about how you hone or brush up on your grant writing skills, why it's important to think about project viability and project budgets, but also what the expectation is of funding agencies in this instance of Create New South Wales. And I always like to think about two questions when I start from a writer's perspective, because I've worked both in government and outside of government, and thinking about why we need grants and what do we need grants for. And really, grants are about an investment in artistic practice. They're an investment in art form. They're also an investment in risk-taking, because often with grants you're able to actually negotiate and look at extending your practice and extending the art form. They're also a way to realise really ambitious and strong projects. And for Create New South Wales, we really are looking at supporting projects that you can deliver on the New South Wales Government grant objectives, which are about increasing audiences, which are about New South Wales remains an arts and cultural leader, which are also about artistic excellence and really looking at processes. So, all of these objectives are set out in the guidelines, so it's not something that's not in existence that you can't refer to, and I really do recommend always reading through those when you are writing grants, because it will assist you in getting in that headspace and that time frame as well. Next slide, please. So one of the things why it's really important to also think about budgets and viabilities and when you are grant writing is when you can do it once, you can write for any of them. And this is particularly true of budgets and project plans, because once you have that bedded down, then you know exactly what it is you're asking for, how much you're asking from what organisation, and also how much your project or program will cost to deliver. And so you're able to then reuse that budget for other applications or other funding that you might be seeking. So it becomes a great tool to be able to continue and extend your grant writing process. Create New South Wales provide a range of budget and viability templates that are part of the application. These are as links in the application form, and there's different budgets for annual organisations program or organisation project funding or individual project funding. I'm going to take you through both of those today to be able to talk through the differences, but also to really provide concrete examples of how you might complete these budgets. We also have a budget help guide that's available on the Create New South Wales website through the funding tab, and one of the amazing Create New South Wales staff will put the link up in the chat box. And one of the things that, particularly if you are an organisation, I do recommend speaking to your organisational bookkeeper or your accountant or your financial officer, even if it's just to get a final check of your figures. It's a good way of actually understanding at a greater depth what you're doing. Next slide, please. So when we think about viability, and particularly when we think about the Create New South Wales viability, this is the how of your project. So this is about demonstrating to the reader, which is the art form boards, that you have the capacity to deliver this project, that New South Wales government funding will be invested in strong and important outcomes of your work, and that you will be able to actually manage the delivery and the financial aspects of a project. And so when you think about the viability, the questions to think about answering are: what steps will you take to deliver what you're proposing? What are the actions or the key milestones that you'll need to meet to actually be able to deliver that? What resources do you need, both cash and in-kind and materials? What do you already have that you will be putting towards the project? And how are you going to use that information to then complete the Create New South Wales templates which we provide? We provide a project and program plan, and we also provide a budget template. You do need to make sure that you're using the right budget template, depending if you're a Mac or a PC user, because that will actually enable the templates to autofill. If you don't use the right one, then it becomes slightly problematic in getting the correct information. Next slide, please. So this is an example of the Create New South Wales project plan, and this is what you really about those key services or milestones or activities that you're going to undertake. So in this plan, you detail an activity or a service that you would be doing. So for example, I've put here, you might be proposing to undertake a series of development workshops as part of your new performance work presentation. This will involve community consultation, so that becomes your brief description. And then in the name, you would be looking at who specifically you'll be working with and will be delivering that. So is it an independent producer? Is it a partnership agency? Is it a community leader? Who will actually be managing and be working with you in delivering the workshops and the community consultations? And what will be their role in that? So are they a leader? Are they a producer? Are they an artist? Are they a performer? Are they a manager? What are they going to be contributing to the project and or program? And then are they confirmed? And if you say yes, you're confirmed here, then we do always recommend that you get a letter of support or an email of confirmation just to say yes, they are here. And this backs up your claims that you're making within the application form. And then the location, this is the venue if you have a particular venue, and or the region, because you might be looking at a festival that activates an entire region. So this is also about identifying that. And are your venues and or your galleries, museums, theatres, concert halls, any of those, if they're confirmed, again, get those letters of support, because it's all about backing up the claims that you've made to show that you can deliver this project, you understand what goes into delivering this project and or program, and you have the support of a range of individuals and organisations. Next slide, please. So this is really about the budget area. And this is about thinking what's going to enable you to deliver a factual budget that is reflective of your program or project, and that that the organisation and the readers, again, the Art From Boards and Create New South Wales, will be able to understand and engage with. And really, it's about not enabling anyone to have any questions or any queries. So you're really trying to show that you understand the breadth of what you're proposing and you understand the costs of that proposal. And things to consider, and this is kind of my top tip in terms of budgeting, is make sure you research your resource costs. So this might be making sure that your travel costs, you've looked at car hire, at petrol costs, you've looked at flights. If we could all fly, that would be wonderful. One day again soon, that would be nice. That you've looked at what are the benchmarks in per diems. The Australian Taxation Office actually sets out the benchmark for per diems, so you can also have a look at that. That you've got quotes for any material costs, for set design, for lighting. If you're doing an outdoor event, do you need to consider things like access to portaloos, to hand sanitizing stations? Have you got quotes for waste management, for garbage? All of those are considerations that literally you can do a Google search and find those costs for, and then you can build those costs into your budget. There's also things with the budget that are things like the award industry wages, and I'll get onto those in the next slide, but this is about ensuring that what you pay your artists is at the benchmark or at the industry standards. At Create, we absolutely support artists being paid. They should be paid for all the work at those industry rates, and that's one of the first things that we look at in a budget to go, yes, we need to make sure that artists are being paid. You also might be getting resources from other partners. Are they supplying materials or time or spaces or even content? And what is the dollar value of that? Even if it is being supplied as in kind, it still will have a dollar value, and you should be reflecting that in your project budgets. Which leads me to the benchmarks of what we need to know about budgets, which is understanding in-kind amounts and how you account for those in both income and expenditure. Also, I'll go through a balance sheet. Again, I cannot stress this enough. Speak to your accountant, finance manager, bookkeeper. Also, make sure that with budgets, you give yourself enough time to always cross-check your figures, and make sure that you're using the Create New South Wales budget templates provided, because once you complete those templates, it actually will enable you to input the correct information into the Smarty Grants application form as well. They're designed to be able to do that so that there's no mismatch of content. Next slide. So this is the artist fees, arts workers fees, salaries, and wages. And these are areas, depending on your art form, that you can actually find the benchmarks for your activity. The National Association for the Visual Arts has a code of practice that sets out the industry benchmarks for the visual arts, craft and design sectors. You'll be able to see how much you should be paying artists for workshops, for talks, if you're commissioning them, what the material fee costs would be. Also, arts workers' salaries and costs are in that code of practice. So it really is about supporting you to be able to manage your project budgets and ensure that your artists and creatives are paid at industry rates. There's also the Live Performance Award, which is through Fair Work Australia, and this covers all live performance, not just the performers, directors, dramaturgs, but also all the tech crew. So how much stage managers should be, how much lighting designers should be, and then you're able to actually cost out your budgets and your people through the Live Performance Awards. There's also the Media Arts Entertainment Alliance, and they provide benchmarks, particularly around writing, journalism, and also performance. AMCOS manage the music royalty costs. So if you are using music within particularly within theatre performances, then you need to consider costs around using that music, and having a chat with APRA AMCOS is always a really good start. If you're a musician and you're performing at on live TV, or you're performing on radio, or your work is being used in a commercial, then that comes under the Broadcasting and Recorded Entertainment Award, which is also managed, I think, through Fair Work Australia. So doing your research in there and getting your costings and payments of fees will assist you in putting your budgets together. Next page. So I've pulled off some of the areas from the individual budget template that Create New South Wales provide. Again, you can access that via your Smarty Grants form, but please select the correct PC or Mac one. And in that form for individuals, you complete the yellow cells. And what it will start with is you'll have income, and it asks for things like your project non-recurrent funding. So this might be project funding that you have received that you will be putting towards this work or this program. It also asks you for things like the amount that you're asking in this grant. So the Create New South Wales, this grant amount, what your request is. It also asks for things like the Australia Council for the Arts, other state and territory agencies, and local government. If you are applying for money for this project or program that you're putting in, put it in here. And you can just say, no, it's not confirmed income. And if you do say it's not confirmed income, I do strongly recommend that with additional information, you include announcements to be made, so the date when that round might be announced. Then there's also things like self-generated funding. So this might be box office support, it might be retail because your museum or gallery has a shop, it might be sponsorship, it might also be philanthropic investment. So this is about your contributions to the project. As you would all be aware, Create New South Wales will not fund 100% of a project, so you need to make sure that even if it's your own sources of income or your own in-kind support, that you've included them in the budget. Which leads me to things like in-kind support. And in-kind support can be the hours that your volunteers do, because you might be a museum that runs solely on volunteer hours. And so you might go, okay, museums and gallery wages are this, we have this many volunteers who do this many hours, this is my estimated in-kind cost, and then you would explain that. So in this example I've put here, I've said something like pro bono services, but then in the additional information, I've explained what that would be. So this would be a marketing and publicity agent. So someone that is giving their services to you for free, but this would be the cash cost of their service. That is where you put in-kind support. The same as if you are putting an exhibition on and someone might donate 100 litres of neon paint so that you can paint your gallery space. That donation of paint would become an in-kind cost that you would be able to put in your income. As with all budgets, they should balance, so your income will always need to meet your expenditure. Next slide. So you'll notice that's 138,300 there, and then my expenditure is also 138,300. And for example, salaries and wages. This might be if you're looking at visual artists, then you might go to NAVA, you might go, okay, I'm going to commission for this cost. This was an example budget, but I've said 5 artists at 10,000, which is a really great fee, I have to say. But it gives you an idea of, okay, this is how many artists and this is the fee. and I've provided that in the additional information column. And again, it's about explaining the breakdowns, because if there are large figures, the panel and Create New South Wales are going to want to know how you arrived at those figures and what the breakdown of those figures are. There's producer fees, Welcome to Country community consultation fees, for example. And again, your budget is also about supporting the claims that you're making in your application. So if you're saying in your artistic plan, I'm going to run all these workshops that are going to involve community consultation, those workshops and community consultation should also be reflected in your budget. So you should be looking at fees that you're paying people to either run, facilitate, or participate in those. The other key thing to think about is when you are paying artists. There was legislation that came in a couple of years ago which made it mandatory to pay super and on costs if a fee is over $400. So when you do budget salaries and wages, you also actually need to include your on costs, and on costs are paid at 21% of the agreed wage. So that's 10% for super, because super has been incrementally increasing over time, 3% for workers' comp, and then if they're a longer term employee, then it's 7.7% for annual leave. And so you'll see here I've included the on costs amount, which is based on the cost of the artists and creatives, the producer, and the Welcome to Country fees. It's 21% of those costs is an additional cost as an on cost. And then I've broken down and explained what I've included as those on costs. Then you'll see there's things like production costs. And for example, I've included things like let me just have a look, staging costs or technical costs or venue hire. And again, it's about breaking those down. So even though it might not seem 5,500, might not seem like a large item, people want to know what the breakdown is of that. So you'll see in the notes and in the columns, I've actually provided that as additional information. And on the budget templates, there is additional information. Then you might want to include publication or marketing costs. And because in income, we included an in-kind publicist as a pro bono, we now need to ensure we're also including that as an expense, because for individual budgets, they always need to balance. So there should be no deficit and no surplus for an individual applicant's budget. And this is because if you have a surplus, questions might be raised on, well, why do you need government funding if you're going to make a surplus on this project? If it's a deficit, then you're not demonstrating that it is a viable project. So for individuals, you really need to always make sure that your expenses and your income is the same. And that means if you put in-kind costs in your income, you also need to put those costs in your expenditure. Great. So the next one is I'm going to take you through an organisation's budget, and I'm going to use the template that you'll be able to access through Smarty Grants. This means that Nikita needs to give me presenting control. I all ask that you be a bit patient because my go-to skills are okay, but I feel like this just might take a moment. And this is so you can see the actuals of how and where to put in figures in an organisational budget, because they do differ. Okay, so I think, yay. Great. So Nick or Nikita, you might just tell me when you can see this budget template.
Yep, can see.
Great, thank you. Amazing. So as an organisation, Create New South Wales has an understanding that you have either a finance officer, you might be subject to audits. So we ask for more detailed information because often also organisations are applying for more money. So your budget expectations is also commensurate to your budget ask. So this is what the budget template for organisations looks like. And you'll see the key tabs down the bottom here. We have an instructions tab, a key terms tab, the summary, a balance sheet, and then the Smarty Grants. So once you complete your summary and your balance sheet tabs, that will autofill into this Smarty Grants form for reference, and then you use these figures and input that into your actual Smarty Grants application. So, for example, you might say, this application, again, I'm asking for 25,000, but I'm also asking from Department of Planning 30,000. Oh, I asked for 30,000 last financial year from Department of Planning, and I'm also asking again this year for 30,000. So already we're at a 55. You might have got last year 10,000 from local government, but you might be looking at increasing that this year to 15,000. For Create New South Wales, this grant, it's not confirmed, so you would click no. There's a little tab that you click in and you go, for that one you don't need to explain as the response is not required. We know you haven't got this one. But for this one, you might go, no, it's not confirmed. And then here you might say waiting on announcement, which is scheduled. I can't spell, you get to see that for 30th of July. 2021. So it's just about providing that additional information. If you're in recurrent funding or if you had funding in 2019 for multi-year, you would put the amounts here. So you might have had 80,000 in the 2019, but then that went up. Wouldn't we all love that? To 100,000 from 2021 onwards. We understand that some organisations work in calendar years, some organisations work in financial years. When we ask for the 2019 accounts, if you work in a calendar year, that's your 2019 accounts. If you work in a financial year, that's your 2019 to 2020 accounts. And again, the budget, if you are working on a calendar year, then this would be from when your project starts. So it might be from 2022 and it might be asking for all of 2022, or if it's a financial year, it might be 2021 to 2022. Again, it's really about how your organisation works on whether it's calendar or financial. And then you'll see again here the same as individuals, there's options of how you might get income. If there's other self-generated income, so you might say retail, again you can see my great spelling, and merchandise sales. And so you can just enter into the yellow. And you might say this year we're hoping for 5,000, we got 2,500 last year. Oh, there you go, royalties, other income. And again, donations or trusts, sponsorships, and in-kind support. So you might say sponsorship in kind, A media company might be supporting you. That might be sponsorship in kind because they're running free adverts on their social media platform, and that might be at a value of $4,000. Then you might also have volunteer support wages, and last year you might have estimated that at 50,000. This year you've got 3 new volunteers, so you might be at 75,000. And you would say, yes, I've confirmed those volunteers, and then you do a breakdown. So you might go 20 volunteers at 25 per hour for 12 hours a week. So really, this is that moment where you can explain all your breakdowns, and that's what we want to see, because you don't want to leave any space for questions or conjecture. Again, you might be running educational programs and you might get investment from partners in that, or you might have students signing up, and that's where you're getting income from. And then your expenses. So this is where you would be adding your artists, your creatives, your producers, your curators, your musicians, your I'm trying to think, conductors, anyone who is fulfilling a creative role. This comes into your artists and creative. Then your production and technical salaries and wages. Note, there's salaries and wages, so all of these are for your salaries and your wages. So this might be your stage managers, your lighting designers, your videographers, your documentation, people who are documenting your works. It might be your tuners, your roadies, your tech crew. This is where they would come. And then marketing and business development. This is publicists, marketing material, marketing specialists, audience development and audience engagement. So if you're developing those strategies, you might be getting specialist people on. It's also business development. So if you're getting on organizations or companies who might be writing your strategic plans or taking you through a strategic planning process, this is where they would go. And again, you have this option of explaining exactly who they are and what they're doing. So please use all the space. And again, you can see add new rows if you need more spaces. Then you've got the management and admin staff. So this might be your executive directors, your artistic directors, your producers, your in-house producers, your tour coordinators. This is where all of those admin staff will come in. And then it goes on to project costs, non-salaries. So again, this might be exhibition costs, venue hire costs, or your technical costs. It might be printing, website development. You'll see we've got all the examples here. Travel and accommodation. Please note that the Australian Taxation Office does set out the benchmarks for what people should be paid as per diem, and also here is where you might put things like ground transport, and then you might put in the description taxi fares or car hire at this figure. So really make sure it's you're describing what you need. And then again, the program costs. And this is where you put your operational costs in. So this might be your audit costs, your bookkeeper costs, the banking. It might be any rents, utilities. It might be any costs to ensure that the work that you're doing is accessible to everyone. It might be consultants. It might be general admin, which could be things like phones, printing, insurance costs. This is your kind of operational expenses and your depreciation costs. And again, your finance manager or accountant will be able to tell you what your depreciation costs. And then if there's any other expenses. And sometimes for organizations, people may like to put a contingency in, but if you do, I do recommend you explain the rationale for having that contingency, and it might be if you're looking at international travel or touring, it might be around COVID, and also make sure that that contingency cost may be one of the costs that the organisation is contributing to, because that's going to be seen that you're actually thinking about the delivery also. Then you have your balance sheet, and I'll go through what these key terms are back on the slides. But again, you just need to fill in the amounts from your last audited accounts. And then you put the drafts in for this. Your finance person or your bookkeeper will be able to print you out a balance sheet. If you use accounting software like Xero or MYOB, they can literally just spit out a balance sheet, and your draft accounts are your years to date. And so we do know that this one will change. You're not bound by blood. It's just about making sure we see where you're at. And then once you've filled all that in, you'll see that the Smarty Grant form reference has already filled in all of that detail. And then what you need to do, which is the same for individuals, is transfer this detail then into the Smarty Grants form itself. So that's the organisation budget. I'm going to go back to trying to see if I can give this to Nikita so that we can take you through. Oh, actually, I can do it. So I can take you through the rest of the forms. I did say you'll have to bear with me for one moment whilst I find, here we go, the PowerPoint. Great. I've just done it. Thank you all for your patience. There we go. And Nikita, can you tell me when you can see the PowerPoint?
Yep, can all see.
Great. So, as I said, I would kind of go through the balance sheets. This is an explanation of what you need to include in the balance sheets. This is also in the budget fact sheet, which is in the how-to guides on the Create New South Wales website, and Nick will put a link up to there. But ostensibly, it's a summary of where your organisation is at. So cash and cash equivalents is how much money you have in the bank, how much money you might have sitting in the drawer in your petty cash tin. Also, if you're lucky enough where you might have investments in shares, this would come up in your cash or cash equivalents. Receivables and prepayments, this is about invoices that you've sent out that you're waiting for people to pay. So it's money that's coming to you, you just don't have it yet. Current assets are assets that include, they might be office inventories, they might be hanging spaces, they might be also objects from your collection. Then property and plant equipment is all your capital costs. So this might be if you own a building, if you own, say, a really fancy schmancy climate controlled air conditioning machine, that's where this would go. Non-current assets are investments that might be long-term. So you might have, I'm just trying to think, shares that you can't touch. That's where that would go. Then you're looking at your current trade creditors and other payments. So this is money that you actually owe. So this is money that you might need to pay in superannuation. It might be workers' comp amounts that you need to pay to the Australian Taxation Office. This is really what you need to pay out on a regular basis. Then there's also income in advance. So this is the prospective grants and ticket income if relevant. So you only need to put your ticket income if you run a box office that you are expecting to get, because, and the reason that this is a liability, if you don't get it, how will you deliver the projects that those grants have been associated with? Then there's also your other current liabilities, and this is where things like your GST, your superannuation, and your workers' comp payments that you have to make as an organisation, this is where they would sit. So these are the ones that you haven't paid, but you know you will need to pay out. Your non-current liabilities are things like long service leaves, and that is because as an organisation you need to budget for employees' long service leaves, even though they may not take it or may not be there to accrue it enough. It becomes a liability because if they do, the organisation will ultimately have to pay it out. Then there's restricted and designated reserves. And again, this is the reserves are the money that you need to put away to make sure that you can make payments on your non-current liabilities. And then the retained earnings is your net assets minus your liabilities, and that should be your equity or your retained earnings. Your finance or bookkeepers will literally be able to print you off a balance sheet, much like a profit and loss statement. If you are a really small organisation who doesn't have a bookkeeper, your accountant will be able to do the same, particularly if you're using software like Xero or MYOB, they'll just be able to spit it out. So that's your balance sheet. So from a Create perspective, and also from my perspective, when I think about the top budgeting tips to consider, is give yourself time. Don't try and do the budget 20 minutes before the deadline. I have been guilty of that before. Really give yourself time to do your research, to figure out what's going to go into your project, what you need to deliver. Get someone to check your figures, which is why the Excel spreadsheets work so well, because you can auto sum a lot of them and you're able to see instantaneously if your figures are balancing. Make sure that you're including detail, and I would say for anything like 5,000 and above, do a breakdown in the additional information section that actually explains how you arrived at that figure. Make sure you're considering contingency costs if relevant, and make sure that you're refining your costings, because, and I say this more for organisations, to be really frank, sometimes if you read a budget, because we read so many of them, we can see if things have been padded out almost instantaneously. So be really honest and real in those costings and in your balance sheets. And if you do have any questions, then we will be able to support you in that process.